everyone, welcome back to a new episode of For the Love of Weather podcast. This is the podcast where we discuss all things weather and how they can impact our daily lives. We hope that you leave this episode and every episode that you listen to loving the weather just that little bit more. Hi, I'm meteorologist Gemma.
Hello there, I'm meteorologist and weather presenter Aisling, and in this episode we are going to speak to David Cran. Now, David Cran is an expert in aviation. What a broad thing to say. David is an absolute expert at what he does, but he's worked in aviation for 34 years in a range of roles, including air traffic control, airfield operations, airport manager, meteorological observer. He's worked at both big and small airfields, which do require a lot of very different handling. I definitely know that. And you've handled a range of air traffic from hot air balloons to big aircraft such as the A380 and even Airforce One. So exciting. David is currently Group Compliance and Assurance Lead for Manchester Airport Group, which covers Manchester, East Midlands and Stansted Airport. That is quite a list we've got there, David. You're very welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you ever so much for allowing me to come on and talk to you.
I'm pretty much sure that your 34 years are not going to get covered in this podcast. I only did aviation for about maybe 5 years. And so I can't imagine what 34 years teaches you.
Well, you do get to see a lot of different weather, and certainly working shift. You see some very good sunrises, definitely.
You definitely get to know who's a good person to work with on shift and who's a bad person to work with on shift. But as always, we start each episode by asking their guest where their love of what they have done has come from. So I'm guessing for you, it would have started up with at some point looking up at the sky, either at clouds or at airplanes, or possibly both.
A little bit of both. So I'm originally from Devon, and we brought up right in the sticks in a tiny little hamlet. And my dad was a farm labourer, so sort of with a farming background, you're very tied to the weather. So I always knew what was going on, particularly sort of the seasons, harvest, etc. But also where we were, we used to get a lot of overflying aircraft. So for a long time, I wanted to be a farmer, and then I keep seeing these aircraft flying over. Even the sound of a light aircraft in the summer sort of reminds me of those long summer sort of down in Devon. So I kind of decided against the farming because that did look like really long hours, and then I'll try aviation.
Because that's not long hours, right?
Well, little did I know.
I guess you've got one very, though, commonality there in that you're actually working quite close to the land and you're constantly watching the sky and what's happening around you and having to make decisions based on environmental factors. There is actually quite a lot in common there.
Yeah, well, I mean, I started, I originally wanted to be a pilot, and unfortunately, for medical reasons, I couldn't pass the medical for the RAF. So I opened up, this is probably date me, the Yellow Pages, and anything connected with aviation I just rode away to. And there was a job at Exeter Airport for a briefing clerk. So effectively just taking the landing feed and passing out the weather pack to the pilot. So any aircraft that's flying for commercial reasons must have an actual weather and a forecast of where they're going to, so they know that they can actually conduct the flight safely or within their requirements. And so part of that, then I got sent on a Met Observers course, so I could do the official weather observations for Exeter Airport. And so that meant a week at Shinfield Park near Reading, where the Met Office used to be based, looking at clouds and just saying what they were, and temperatures and dew points and pressures, etc. And then, which was more interesting for me, then a week at RS St Morgan, as it was, Newquay Airport now, and shadowing the weather forecast there to sort of craft it. You had a really big book that you just had to open up and scribe the half-hour weather observations and put in specials if any of the criteria changed. So that was the real start of learning the just looking out the window and seeing what it's doing.
So that now is all so that's sign-up code that you're talking about. So do you want to tell us a little bit about what sign-up code is, and tell us what a special is as well?
So it's very important for pilots to know exactly what the weather's doing at the time. So surface wind and speed and direction. So if you take just something as simple as a fixed-wing aircraft, it's actually the airflow over the wing that generates the lift. So you get a low pressure above the wing and a high pressure below the wing. So effectively, you could argue, the aircraft are getting sucked up into the air. So they generate more lift if they're taking off into wind, just like birds do. So they need to know the wind speed and direction. But then there's also the visibility criteria, the types of cloud, and the heights. There's two direct types of cloud that they need to know, cumulonimbus and towering Q, because that affects their operations, as well as then the temperature and dew point, which gives an indication of how saturated the air is. The temperature also gives an indication of how dense the air is, and wings as well as engines perform better at colder temperatures. And then something called, we love codes and acronyms in aviation, so something called the QNH. So that's the relative air pressure above sea level. Without going into too much detail, but if you're in a plane, you've got something called an altimeter. If you were just to sat on the apron over a course of a week, you'll see your aircraft kind of rising and falling in relative height according to the altimeter, because effectively the altimeter is just like a barometer, and it's measuring the air pressure. So when you have highs and lows crossing the airfield in pressure, you'll see your altimeter going up and down. So they constantly need to be calibrated so the aircraft knows how high it is above a particular datum, and that could be the aerodrome or it could be the sea level. So if ever you listen to any sort of phraseology being taught to pilots, you'll constantly hear when initially talking is what the QNH or the QFE is, and that's the pressure either above sea level or above the aerodrome. Because if you're taking off from the aerodrome, you just tend to land back at the aerodrome. You want to know how high you are above the aerodrome. If you're actually going somewhere and you need to look on your chart and see, well, I want to avoid masts or mountains, I need to know, and all the masts and mountains on your map are measured above sea level, I need to know how high I am above sea level. So that's when we use the QNH. So the different pressure settings gives that different data for the pilots. And a special is when one of those criteria have changed. You suddenly need to let all the air crews know at the same time, be it a change in the pressure, or the fact the wind speed is changing direction or gusting, or there's different types of change in visibility or cloud types, particularly if they're cumulonimbus or towering Q.
So my biggest discomfort, shall we call it, was if I had gone for a viz, bearing in mind it was low flying aviation. And let's say I know below 300 meters, they can't do certain things. And you see, your viz points, and also the machine is telling you, and your eyes are telling you, it's definitely not 300, it's 200. It's like absolute nightmare. Everything you're talking about, though, is very much resonating with me. And actually, it's really making me smile, because I loved my time in aviation. I absolutely loved it. It made me such a, well, I suppose it sounds like I'm blowing my own trumpet here, but made me such a good forecaster. And actually observing the sky, all those clouds you're talking about naming. I mean, if you're watching the sky, you can tell what's happening with the weather from the clouds. They literally tell you what's happening and what's going to happen for, even sometimes, depending on what type of cloud it is, the higher it up it is, when, what it's going to be like in the next 24 or 48 hours.
Absolutely. I mean, I do remember when I was sort of studying, that sun as viewed through ground glass, which was like the approaching front. So you knew actually, no, rain's definitely coming. So you get all that, even just as, like I say, the job was just to give the actuals. But at smaller airports, when you opened up, you wouldn't get a main forecast from the Met Office until you produced two actuals, so they could confirm what was happening at the moment to verify the forecast. So invariably, as an air traffic control system, you turn up sort of an hour before the first flight, so you could get those two actuals out, and you were looking at them like, what is it? What height is that? Yeah. And this was when I first started. This was before laser cloud-based recorders.
Yeah.
And we used to have something extra airport at night. We had an old Second World War searchlight and an alidade, so you could shine the searchlight up onto the cloud base, and then you had a chart to read off the angle to work out how high the cloud was at night. So laser cloud-based recorders have made that bit so much easier.
So clever how they did it before. So it's really is quite amazing. And also the cloud-based recorders are amazing now for things like, forecasting for, unusual clouds that might appear in the stratosphere, like where you're, picking up moisture up at much higher levels. You can hear we could probably talk about observations for quite a bit. I love a TAF and a METAR myself. But anyway, let's plow on, right? So you've got through all of this weather observing. You're falling more and more in love with it is working at an airport. Exeter Airport's well, now it's a busyish airport. It's not one of the busiest. Fast forward now to some of the bigger airports. So put all this into context as an operations manager. Now, who are you talking to?
Right. So somewhere like Stansted. So it's a 24-hour operation, sort of 670 odd movements a day on a busy day, up to 53 movements an hour. So obviously, your main concern is that safe. Aircraft are incredibly elegant in the air, but they're a bit ungainly on the ground because they've got these tiny little retractable undercarriage, and so you need to make sure that it's a safe surface for them to operate, as well as for the passengers and crew to get to and from the aircraft. So you're constantly looking at what the weather's doing. So summer months are a lot easier than winter months, as you can imagine, although there are still problems. So with recent sort of really hot weather, there can be issues such as flight performance, like I said. So just the temperature, the air density, the warmer the air gets, the less dense it is. And it's the air density that gives the performance to the engines and also the lift. So the pilots are constantly recalculating that. And it could be on a shorter runway that pilots will either need to not carry as much fuel and do what we call a tech stop somewhere else if they're going a long way to get additional fuel if they can't actually depart off the runway at full length, or actually offload cargo or passengers. Very rarely offloading passengers because that you get a lot more complaints that way. But I have worked, when I worked at Bristol Airport, we used to have quite small aircraft that would do flights quite far away, and in the summer, because Bristol Airport was that little bit higher, so again you also lose air density, that they would have to offload some cargo or do a tech stop on the way, which adds to the flight simply because of that. And then actually recently, with the really hot temperatures, because of course your surface of your runway is made of asphalt. Invariably, we have asphalt runways and concrete taxiways and aprons in Northern Europe. And that's simply because where your aircraft are standing for a long time, if you have an asphalt surface, they can sink into it. But concrete is nice and robust. It's called what we call a rigid surface. And if you have any fuel spills, then it doesn't eat away the bitumen. So you'll see sort of concrete aprons, but the concrete takes a long time to repair. So you wouldn't want your runway out of action if you had to repair it. So asphalt's quick to repair, but does have a slightly lower melting point. So the runway surface can get 45 to 60 degrees, in really hot weather. So we use something called grooved Marshall asphalt, which is an aviation mix for our asphalt. But as the runways get old, they last about sort of 15 years with wear and tear and UV light making the bitumen brittle. You can have failures in really hot summers we're starting to experience now.
I was actually just about to say, you were talking about Bristol Airport. There's nothing more of a sinking feeling than seeing Bristol going into fog at 4 a.m.
Well, the unique
and then
thing,
you think, oh no,
yeah, the unique
this
thing
TAF is all wrong.
Yeah, so to be very fair to my colleagues at Bristol Airport, so when I was working there, Bristol was actually built as a bad weather training aerodrome for the RAF. So it was built up. The Bristol Lulsgate was built up on a hill, so they'd know there's very, be sometimes working there, you have 25 knot fog, which was quite because it was just right up the hill, and you'd have days where you'd not see any aircraft operate, and they'd all go to Cardiff or Birmingham. So it does suffer there. What they have been able to do, despite the topography, they've actually been able to kink the road round and get a better what we call instrument landing system, ILS. So there's different categories, and they've been able to get a category 3, which means that aircraft can make it in with lower visibility criteria. So you get a lovely view from the tower up there. You can see right across the Bristol Channel into Wales and the Severn Bridge. But yeah, it was prone to a lot of fog, very fast moving fog in the winter.
Yeah, it's a bizarre little place. I think it's 600 meters up, isn't it, from memory? Maybe
It's very high.
yeah.
I don't think it's quite high. I think it's the second highest licensed aerodrome in the country. I can't remember if it's Dunk as well or somewhere up in Scotland that's higher as a licensed aerodrome. But yeah, no, they're quite unique.
So you just mentioned some ILS there. Do you want to talk a little bit about instrument landing systems?
So obviously, there's different types of flying. So there's something called VFR, visual flight rules. So if you're flying in a little aircraft, I did have my training for my pilot's license. So I was flying in a little sort of propeller driven 4-seater aircraft. and I had to fly called VFR, visual flight rules. So there was certain weather criteria, and the way I would avoid bumping into things like hills as well as other aircraft is I had certain cloud and visibility criteria and minima that I could fly. So basically, it had to be a really nice day, so I could look out the window, see and avoid. But obviously, if you're traveling to Spain on your holidays, it wouldn't be very good if the pilot says, "Well, it's cloudy today, I can't fly." So there's something called instrument flight rules. So that's where the pilots are actually operating on their instruments, so they can fly through cloud. And that's fine because they're under full air traffic control, so they won't bump into mountains and they won't bump into each other. But they still need to at some point land. So if it's foggy conditions, they need to have something on the ground that they can lock onto. And the instrument landing system makes two parts. So basically, there's a localizer, which gives them effectively their left and right guidance. And then there's a glide path, which gives them up and down guidance. And they can lock onto that and then follow that down. And somewhere like Heathrow pretty much has sort of blind landings where the aircraft can lock on and follow it all the way down. There's lots of what we call safeguarding on the ground that we need to do to make sure that these instrument landing systems aren't deviated. So they have very large protection areas. So if I was to drive my Land Rover through those areas while it's being used, there's monitor systems that would decouple the aircraft, so because basically the metal vehicle would deviate the beams.
Don't want to do that then.
No, it's not quite like the Die Hard 2 movie. It's certainly not like that. But yeah, no, it's incredibly well safeguarded. But that's how we can kind of guarantee pretty much operation. But you get different versions of them. So so for a pilot, it's not only the airport that has to have the certain type of instrument landing system, and that depends on the minute. The aircraft needs to be equipped with the right equipment, and the pilots need to be trained. So there's that. You need all three lined up to be able to maximize the poorest visibility. So sometimes you can be delayed simply because a bit of kit isn't working in the aircraft, or all the pilots aren't trained to that standard to be able to follow it.
We're all speaking the same language. That's what we hope.
It's definitely experience when you land in fog. Like I was flying once and we was going through this fog, you couldn't see anything, and all of a sudden we were on the runway, and I was like, how the hell did they just land this plane? Literally, you couldn't see anything outside the windows. I was like, that is some impressive landing, and it's so impressive when they land in that dense fog.
Yeah, I mean, the good thing about fog, particularly sort of radiant phase, and most fog, and Bristol aside, is normally still air. So actually, the aircraft doesn't get the turbulence as it's coming in foggy conditions because actually it's still air. When I used to work at Exeter, because it wasn't very high, I think it was about 102 feet above sea level, and you had the River Exe, you get a lot of radiation fog. And we used to get a Bryman Airways coming up from Plymouth that would drop into Exeter and then fly on up to Gatwick. And the number of times you could look up and you could see it flying overhead, but because you had maybe 100 foot of sort of low-lying sort of radiation fog, as they kind of enter the approach, they get what we call something slant phase. So they're actually looking through deeper sort of distance of fog. And they would have to go around because they reached their minimum, not being able to then see the runway, and had to go around. Yet you could then look up and see it in the clear blue sky. So it must be incredibly frustrating for those passengers sat next to seeing their plane then divert and carry on up to Gatwick.
It reminded me of all of my exams: slant visibility, horizontal visibility. Do you know, let's you touched off something there actually that I think is in everybody's psyche at the moment, perhaps more so this year than ever before. And you mentioned about it's becoming a bit, we've had a lot of hot air. The runways are getting broken down a little bit quicker. Seasons are changing. How have you observed climate through your job? It's clearly it would have meandered through it, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think we're definitely seeing more extremes, and I think that's fair enough to say for everyone. I mean, to the point that the Department of Transport write to the major airports in the UK every year to say, how are you prepared for these different things, and they will cover like what's your protection against flooding. And again, poor old Exeter Airport recently with the horrific downpours they had with that thunderstorm activity did get flooded. But Gatwick, unfortunately, had a very bad Christmas where they got flooded, and it flooded their sort of generators, so they lost power. So we're being asked to kind of look at what's our resilience against these different extreme weathers, and it can be incredibly strong winds to the point that you reach your maximum wind speed, you can't open the aircraft doors because it's not safe to disembark passengers. It's over the air bridge limitations. Obviously, touched on flooding. Extreme cold weather. regular sort of frost and sort of de-icing of aircraft, and and just again the environmental impacts of the chemicals you're putting on the aircraft, and actually how can you manage that and ensure 100% safety, but then have an eye on the impact that you're having on the environment. So when I very first started, we had some incredible products that you could put on the ground, but probably weren't very environmentally friendly. So what you could hear the ice cracking, that they were that effective. Whereas now we've got a lot more environmentally friendly products, but it does change the way that you actually use them, because so take aircraft de-icer. So it has a high BOD, bio-oxygen demand. So when it gets into the water courses, bacteria like to feed on it because it's a glycol mix. And it's a bacteria multiplying that then takes oxygen out of the water. So we need to make sure that we retain all the runoff from the runways and from the aprons where the aircraft are being de-iced, capture in what we call balancing ponds, and basically allow this bacteria to break down all the glycol and de-icer, and then re-aerate the ponds, put water back in, air back into it, to the point that it then meets our what we call discharge consents with the Rivers Authority, where we can then discharge that water back effectively as clean with the air correct oxygen levels, so that it's not causing any impact on the fish. Scandinavian countries have a glycol recovery system because they use it so much more, obviously in colder climates, where it's actually trying to recover that aircraft de-icer. And it might be hypocritical, but I've heard that the glycol will never be reused for aircraft de-icing because it has to be a certain grade, but is good enough for cough syrup because that has a lot of glycerine in it. So good for human consumption, but you can't use it again on aircraft.
The fact that somebody has figured that out is mind-blowing.
I feel like we can't have you on the podcast and not chat about snow. I feel like we have to chat about snow and the impact that snow can have on airport operations and aircrafts, and maybe delaying people's flights. So
David, basically you need to tell us everything you know about snow.
Right. Well, crikey, where do I start? So yeah, snow can be quite a problem with aviation. So if we just start again from the aircraft themselves. So basically anything that is on the wing, so frost or snow, that basically affects the ability of the aircraft's lift. Aircraft icing can actually sort of add weight to the aircraft, and it can cause some issues that way. But the main thing is, because you want a clean airflow to get that pressure differential for a wing to work, you want to have a nice smooth surface. So just on a cold night when it's frosty, the aircraft will need to anti-ice to make sure that there's no frost on the wing. If you've got snow, you need to get rid of that snow first and then treat the ice underneath. In the UK, we're maritime temperate climate, so we do tend to have very high water content snow, which is great if you want to make snowmen and snowballs, but it's terrible if you're trying to have friction, high friction surfaces. So it doesn't take a lot of snow before we would have to close the runway and taxiways and clear them. To give you an idea, we had an operator at Stansted that was able to take their Boeing 767, so really big, sort of like 350-seater aircraft, and go down to Antarctica and land on the pack ice there, because actually very dry snow below -15, you can land on it. We have Father Christmas flights to go up to Lapland and land on snow-covered runways because it's effectively powder snow. So if you're into skiing, powder snow, really good. But 3 millimeters of slush, and I had to close the runway and sweep it off. And slush, for the technical terms, is it makes a splatting sound if you use a heel-toe action on the surface. So that's how we decide if you've got slush as opposed to wet snow. Even sort of wet snow, we can go up to about 13 millimeters before we know it starts affecting the braking actions. But 13 millimeters over a 3-kilometer runway is not very much. So it doesn't take much. So we do see all the press saying, like, oh my goodness, Britain's ground to a halt again, and how do the Europeans do it? All of our snow kit is bought from Europe. It's European grade snow kit. And occasionally when we do get very dry snow, and we've had a few winters where there's been nice weather, my kit drives down the runway. We have 11 what we call prime movers that can cover the whole width of the runway. They drive down with brushes, snow blowers and blades. and we can clear the 3 kilometre runway in 20 minutes, and it's a breeze. Whereas once you get slushy snow and then it freezes solid and causes ridges, and yeah. So to a certain extent, we had the wrong kind of snow. And there are changes. To give you an idea, we used to have halogen lights. All our runway lights used to be halogen lights, so too hot to touch. Now we've got an LED, which again is great from the environmental point of view because it takes a lot less energy to turn them on and keep them running, but there's no heat. So again, we would end up probably closing quicker to clear the snow off the lights now because then they're not melting the snow like they used to.
So talk about wet and dry snow. So, it's all about that dew point. Where has your air come from? And I distinctly recall a night on an airfield where we were transitioning from a maritime to a polar air mass. But like always, these things take 24 to 36 hours. So the first night knew it was going to be a nightmare, or sort of early hours, because obviously there's the other complicated element of if there's showers, is the shower going to hit the runway? But as you transition into a maritime or a polar air mass or something that has much lower dew points, then you kind of know as your nights go on, if you're established in that air mass, then your nights are going to be easier to clear the runway, or you won't have to worry about it as much because obviously it's just really powdery. But most of the time in the UK, that doesn't happen.
Indeed. No, it's unfortunate. And like you say, it's very much the time of day that it hits. So the worst time for snow for most big airports in the UK is sort of like 6 o'clock in the morning, because that's what we call first wave. So we've quietened down overnight, just cargo flights. Likewise, Heathrow sort of like starts up. They have a night curfew. We are at Stansted, it is 24/7, same as Manchester and East Midlands. But when you start having the passenger flights and we're all trying to go out and it's snowing, then it's very hard to recover. Whereas if it happens sort of 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, you get a chance to be able to work on it and have it ready for the first wave. So it has less impact. So it really does depend when it's happening. And once you start clearing snow, if you've got sort of like 15 millimeters across the entire runway, once you start tying up because you're sweeping it up, then you've got to carry on. So you're committed then, and you want to move it as much as you can, because if you let it then freeze, then you've got concrete effectively. So you want to deal with the snow as much as you can while it's still movable. And that's not even to then count if it's starting to drift or whatever. So so the wind speed. And then once you've opened, because invariably there's great pressure, because aircraft are possibly already in the air. So there's great pressure to open the runway to allow these aircraft to land without diverting. And as soon as you open and start having aircraft movements, it's much harder to then move your snow kit around. And if it's still snowing, invariably you're in something called low visibility procedures, which ATC then have to, air traffic control, then have to restrict the number of movements. So it then takes much longer. So it is quite a protracted operation. And in the UK, normally airports are blessed with multiple runways. So there's only actually sort of parallel runways. There's only Heathrow and Manchester. So you don't have the luxury of some of the other airports where you clear one runway, let them land on that while you're then clearing the other. So we tend to work in a summer operation all the way all the year round in the UK, and then just switch to a winter operation when it's forecast to snow. So we're constantly buying into additional sort of local weather forecasting, so we can see what's going to happen with our own airfield. But I do remember one I'm trying to remember when that was, what year that was, when all the weather came up from the south. So basically, sort of it hit Gatwick, Heathrow, and Luton, and was moving up. So we were the last airport. So we were getting loads of diversions from all the other airports, and then it hit us. So then we were closed as well. So you had lots of planes that you weren't expecting, and ground handlers weren't expecting those, because you only have enough ground handlers for the planes you're normally expecting, and suddenly a load of other planes turn up. So there's always delays. So that doesn't appease the passengers very much if they're then sat on. They're not even at the airport they want to be on, and now they're sat for ages waiting to get offloaded.
I tell you, there's nothing worse than landing in Stansted if you're expected to land in Gatwick.
It sounds like you talk from experience there.
I just, when you, there would have been a point in my life where I would have known all of those TAFs and forecasts, and they would have just, you'd live and breathe them, don't you? But they're so far away.
Yeah.
And if you're visiting London and you don't know anything about London, you think, oh, it's just a London airport. But it's not.
No. And I think it is difficult because we've got so good, I wouldn't say complacent, but aviation's got so robust that actually, the capacity is for all those ideal conditions. So to the point at Heathrow, even in foggy conditions, Heathrow is maxed out all its operations and can't effectively has got too many movements if it's foggy. Because if it's foggy, you have to basically increase the spacing between aircraft on final approach, and there's just not enough airspace to do that. So the only way they can do it is actually cancel flights, which is really upsetting for people if your flight's cancelled. But if they then schedule it as though, every day might be foggy, then actually that's capacity that they're not allowing. So it's hard to kind of get that judgment call of how much do you commit. So you don't unnecessarily reduce your capacity. Places like Stansted, it's almost like a fire break. So we're maxed out on runway movements for the first 3 hours of the day, and then we deliberately don't schedule maximum number of runway movements. So if it has been foggy and those aircraft are getting delayed, we've got kind of almost a fire break to move those additional flights to catch up for the number of rotations. Because an average sort of low-cost operator at Stansted is trying to get sort of 4 to 5 rotations a day to maximize that airframe.
I'm just curious to know what your thoughts are that you don't think that, well, I don't think Heathrow fogs out as much anymore.
No, I mean, they certainly didn't used to ever get snow, and whether it was because the prevailing winds from the city kind of always just kept it that few degrees higher, and we don't. But there was, if a passenger did have to endure that time, and again, I think it was the run up to a Christmas break. It always seems to be a bank holiday or Christmas, where they had thick fog for a number of days, and there was a real backlog. And of course, there's not enough spare capacity in those things. If your flight's cancelled, where do you put all these passengers if the next flight's already full? And being Christmas break, so they had to have marquees installed to hold all the baggage and people in all the hotels. So it probably doesn't, as well as aircraft technology meaning able to cope in sort of minimum kind of weather conditions as much as possible. So but it's a tricky one. But they have something called a delay cancellation matrix, where they look and they ask the airlines, look, it's better to have some flights running on time and strip out the ones that maybe aren't as full, rather than everyone trying to operate and just cause everyone to kind of fall over. And they kind of work that with the airlines to look, it's unfortunate, it's going to be foggy. Which ones do you want to cancel so that you save the rest of the operation? Because you don't want the plane and the pilot somewhere else, as we've seen with the delay from the air traffic that we recently had. So the air traffic computer failure, that was only a relatively short time, but it took days to recover because all the airlines and the crews were all out of sync and out of place and not where they wanted to be. And it takes quite a long time because there's just so much sort of maximum capacity in the operation.
A lot of people, when they're flying, will have experienced turbulence. What is turbulence? What are they actually feeling when they're in the aircraft?
Well, you can get all sorts of different types of turbulence caused by different things. So it depends on how high your aircraft are. So prior to the Second World War, everyone was flying in the troposphere. So literally, that's the band around the Earth that most of our weather sits in. So you're always bumping around with all that weather because you've got so much air movement, not only sort of caused by the mountains and the air moving over there and getting swirled around, but also the vertical uplift. So if you have a lot of thermal activity or unstable air, so I mentioned the cumulonimbus and towering cumulus clouds. So that's a lot of vertical movement. So to the point that aircraft avoid cumulonimbus and ideally towering cumulus simply because of the amount of turbulence they experience there. As you get higher, you can have something called CAT, which is clear air turbulence. So the air's so dry that there's not a cloud formed by the movement of that air. So actually, you can't see it. You can potentially forecast it because you can see if it's down from a mountain wave but also they rely on pilots' reports that they've experienced that turbulence. So when you see them ping on their seatbelt sign and you're up in the cruise at sort of 37,000 feet, it's likely that they've either had a previous pilot report or they have seen the upper forecast of turbulence. And effectively, it's just like eddy currents in the air, just like you'd see it in water. But obviously it can feel quite extreme in an aircraft. So potentially not enough to bring an aircraft down, but it can be enough to put the flight trolley sort of hitting the ceiling and back down again. So you have had flight attendants unfortunately break limbs in severe turbulence. But invariably, that's because the pilots haven't seen it, so clear out evidence. And they have to operate with either they have to have working weather radar. So if you're on a commercial flight, it has to have working weather radar, or it has to a forecast where they know they're not going to have any turbulence. So invariably, they're always working with weather radar, so they can see the cumulonimbus clouds or the Tarry to avoid those. But that can cause other delays anyway. So we get a lot of thunderstorm activity that kind of is between, say, Europe and us, that they can have a big impact on aircraft operations.
There's so many things going on there. I think people would be surprised to hear that the aircrafts have instruments on them that were called weather elements that then get fed into the weather models that then we use for the forecasting. There'll be people that won't be aware that that's happening while they're on their plane flying along. While I'm down here doing my forecasting, it's running on observations that are coming from the aircraft that they're flying on. I always think that's really interesting.
Well, yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, again, when I very first started in aviation in the late 80s, we had our own Met Office at Exeter Airport, and you used to see them go out and put up the weather balloon. They checked there was no flying and let off this weather balloon, and that would then feed back sensors. Now there's so many aircraft in here with very accurate sensors, it makes sense to use those to send that very accurate data back and help formulate your forecast models.
They still send up a couple of sondes every day across the UK.
Yes, I'm not far from Cardington, so that they used to be regular, well, to the point that you'd still see the warnings not to fly over there because there might be Met balloons sent up.
I've never found one of those boxes. I hear stories about people finding them in fields.
Oh, right.
I've not. Yeah.
Didn't Owen once say when we spoke to him that a weather balloon, a past guest said a weather balloon landed in their garden, and that's what sparked their interest in the weather?
I would just be so thrilled.
I once had a lot of hot air balloons land. I used to rent a room in a farmhouse when I was working at Bristol Airport, and Bristol's home to Cameron Balloons. So they're the company that built Richard Branson's balloon when he went across the Atlantic. And so there was a big balloon fiesta at Ashton Court, and this one day they were all blowing out towards the Bristol Channel. So obviously they didn't really want to go right off and visit Wales. So they were all landing in the fields owned by this farmer. And they all obviously they have to then recover those balloons. So I had loads of people knocking on the door saying, "Could we drive our Land Rover and trailer pick up this balloon basket?" And as a way of thank you, not that it was my land, here's a bottle of whiskey. I think I had about 23 bottles of whiskey that day. So yeah, did very well.
It's obviously the currency of hot air ballooning.
Yeah, bless them. They do have almost, because of the distances they travel, it is quite short. They have almost like Ordnance Survey charts printed out, and there will be like different kind of warnings compared with standard aviation charts. These warnings would have, there's livestock in the field there, or unfriendly farmer, shotgun. So they kind of know the bits where they don't want to land and damage any crops.
Tricky old forecasts, the hot air balloon ones.
Oh, yes, very much. So if ever you book a hot air balloon,
it's unlikely to go up.
Yeah, unfortunately,
on the day of your voucher.
On the day of your voucher. Unfortunately, yeah, the weather criteria for balloons, it has to be incredibly light winds. So invariably, it's early in the morning, so it's always an early start. And you need some wind, otherwise you're just going to go up and hover over the same field. But you don't really want anything over sort of 5 to sort of 7 knots, because you've got to try and envelop the canopy, and then once you're going along, as you get the diurnal variation and the winds start picking up as the sun rises, you want to be able to land at a nice safe speed as well. So it's quite a tricky one. I mean, they get some directional control because they can kind of go a bit higher and as the wind back, so they can kind of get a bit of direction control, but they are literally along for the ride. But an incredible sensation. All I remember is like the hot top of my head singeing every time they light the burner and the creak of the wicker basket. But other than that, there is no other sensation because you're traveling with the wind.
No, and the silence, I think, as well up there is unreal. It's so silent. It's crazy. Gemma, do you want to take it away, Dave? We have this little round called Get to Know Me round.
Okay.
And it's so we can tell how incredibly knowledgeable you are. You've probably got a million stories as well that you will never speak publicly out loud of things that have happened. But it's always nice to get to know people a little bit more. So Gemma, do you want to take away?
Yeah, so these are a few random sort of quick fire questions. Some of them are weather related, and then some of them are just very, very random. So, what's your favourite season?
Oh, now I've changed jobs. I would say autumn. Before it never was. So before I used to see the fields getting ploughed and going, oh my goodness, right, winter operations, right, let's start training the teams, get the. Whereas, so now I can thoroughly enjoy autumn and the nights drawing in, and that's great. Whereas before it was spring because got the other side, but spring the other side of Easter because I've actually had more Easters disrupted with snow and adverse weather than I have Christmases.
Autumn must be quite busy though, in terms of the storms that
Yeah,
impact
but
things.
again, selfishly, in the type of aviation I'm in, well, both types of aviation, light aviation, they like to fly in the summer months because they need to look out the window and have good weather. So you're not as busy at work, selfishly. And likewise, at somewhere like Stansted, where you're more sort of touristy type operations. So there's a lot more flights through the summer period. So you've got to the end of the summer. So autumn, you've got to the end of the summer. You've now probably got more the people that don't have children going on holiday, but you're in the wind down towards Christmas, but you haven't actually got into the really bad weather yet, where actually it is starting to affect. So you do get obviously the foggy days, sort of like October time, but it's less disruptive and there's fewer flights to disrupt. So yeah, and you've got over a very busy summer.
So, what's your favourite cloud?
Oh, I would say Simpson sky, so cumulus, those little fluffy ones. And when I was doing weather observations, they were the easiest. So you could actually, through the adiabatic lapse rate, you could work out exactly what height they were because of the temperature differential. So you kind of knew that was an easy one without a cloud-based recorder to work out. And plus, they look sort of pretty, particularly if their streets are queued. So if they formed over a particular hot zone, you just see these rows and lines. So again, if you're a glider pilot, that's nectar because you know you're going to get some good thermal there. But also for ones that are really anti-aviation, but really sort of intimidating, but good to look at cumulonimbus clouds, particularly when you can see the anvil. So the top of the cloud is sort of punched through the stratosphere, turned ice, and is basically getting blown by those higher winds. So
Oh, when they all go all like capillati rather than the
yeah.
calvus.
Yeah,
I know.
And normally, if you can see that, it's so far away that you're not going to get rained on, but it just looks really impressive.
Yeah, you're like, look at that over there. It's
somebody's
not going in our direction, but it's beautiful to look at.
Yeah.
Would you prefer to go to the beach or to the mountains?
For me, and growing up in the countryside, so more mountains than beach.
Although there are some good beaches where you grew up.
Oh yeah, Devon is very good. It's just where I am now. It's a nightmare to get around the M25 to get down there. So actually, I've discovered the Norfolk coast, which is equally as good.
It's a bit silty.
Yes, yeah. Well, I used to when I was at Bristol, I used to live in Western-super-Mare for a bit. So that is second highest tidal range to somewhere in Nova Scotia. So
oh wow,
yes, that was a very silty there.
Hey, we haven't asked this question for a while actually, but I think it's very apt. So, snow, yes or no?
Oh, definitely now. Yes. I don't want to do my colleagues down, but because I'm now no longer responsible for it, I would love a snowy day where I can just go walk in it. I do think it is beautiful. I always have said, I had a colleague that had done far more years than me in aviation, and he just said he went to Lapland with his daughter and he just looked at all that snow and just like, this is lovely, and it's someone else's problem. It is very pretty. And when I don't actually have to be responsible for clearing it, I would love to just go walking it and enjoy it.
Yeah, I know.
We always say that. We're like, snow when I'm not working, but when I'm working, oh, thank you.
Yeah.
If you were a fruit or vegetable, what would you be?
Oh, crikey. Pineapple.
It just amazes me that people immediately answer this question. Everybody answers this question. It's unbelievable. Why would you be a pineapple?
Well, I guess despite the fact I just said I would choose mountains over the beaches, there used to be lilt used to get advertised, and I always imagined lilt with the totally tropical taste and just mending outboard motors on some beach in the Caribbean, and being known to the locals. So I always thought that seemed a very idyllic sort of lifestyle, and pineapples are involved. So
this time.
And unfortunately, I do like it on my pizza occasionally.
So do I.
Controversial.
I love it. Hawaiian all the way.
We'll have lots of comments about that controversial pizza topping there. Okay, so a couple of more questions. So if you could invite one person to dinner, it can be anybody at all from any historical time frame or even a fictional character, who would it be?
Oh, see, I've had an ideal dinner party, and actually, it was going to be there would be Stephen Fry there, but it always was going to have Carol Kirkwood as well because we could talk about the weather. So yes,
They would be some good guests, actually. That would be some good guests. And our final question is one thing that you wish everybody knew about aviation.
it is remarkable, and don't take it for granted for many different reasons. So we could get into the whole climate change and where it's going, but you only need to sort of look back a few generations ago where so few people got the opportunity to fly and get a window seat, look out the window, look at the weather. When on the dullest day, you see the flight crews going out, and you just know that at some point they're going to pop out and see sunshine that day. Look at the weather from above, because there are so many of our ancestors never got that opportunity.
Yeah, it is quite unique. So I always know that as well. If you've got like nice blanket of strata Q, but you will eventually just boop through it, and then randomly in the distance, you'll just see some mad cumulus that for whatever reason, there's one cell that has just developed into this on a relatively stable day, this huge cloud. And you're like, there's just so much about the atmosphere we don't know or can't capture, in that much detail. It's fascinating. So we'd like to leave all of our guests with a weather wisdom. So David is going to tell us a little bit about the jet stream and which flight not to take from America, should I say, to arrive into the UK. So when you don't want to take it, do you want to tell us a little bit about that, Dave?
Yeah, so the jet streams are, and they've obviously been in the news recently because that's been causing all the extra heat down in Europe because of where the jet streams are placed. The jet streams actually do aid aviation, particularly for coming from America into the UK, because you can basically travel the jet stream, and they can be up to sort of 220 odd miles an hour, so it can definitely shorten the flight time coming from west east back into the UK. But obviously, if they're too good and in the right place, then the early morning flights can arrive too early, and Heathrow has a night curfew, so we can't open before they can accept those flights. So the early morning flights, and then they get put into the hold. So either the pilots have to slow down so they're not burning extra fuel just holding. So an afternoon flight can be a bit better for getting straight in and maximising the use of the jet stream.
And a fabulous time for drinking champagne.
Oh, well, yes, depending which class you're flying, but definitely.
David, thank you so much for talking to us this evening. We've loved talking to you, taking me a little bit of a memory lane as well with aviation. I love the operations side of an airport, just fantastic. But we have really appreciated you being here with us tonight and sharing all of your lovely stories as well.
Thank you. Thanks for allowing me to join your podcast.
If you have enjoyed this podcast and would like to subscribe, rate, review, and share it, we would love that. You can find us on all your podcast streaming platforms. If you would like to follow us on Instagram, we are For the Love of Weather. On Twitter, we are the #4 Love of Weather. And we just hope that you leave this episode loving the weather just that little bit more.
Thanks for listening. Bye.